December 7th, 1941. At 0750 hours, the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor. The attack plunged the United States into war and transformed the conflict that had begun in Europe into a global war. However, Japan's role in World War II did not begin at Pearl Harbor. But years earlier, in 1937, when Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. In 1926, a new Japanese emperor ascended the chrysanthemum throne, and a new era was announced. It took the name Showa, meaning enlightened peace. The emperor was Hirohito.
で、ヒロヒト天皇は若い時に、皇太子の時に、イギリスおよびヨーロッパをずっと回っております。天皇になるもんですから、なるのが間近だったもんですから、諸外国を見た。それが初めてヒロヒト天皇が海外ヨーロッパを、それまでの自分の生活はいわゆる籠の鳥だった。
Hirohito ruled according to a constitution drawn up after Japan's doors, which had been closed for centuries, were forced open. Less than 100 years before the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan existed in selective seclusion. Then, in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry and his Black Fleet sailed into Tokyo Bay with instructions from the American president to prise the country open.
This is the era of high imperialism. All the powers, Britain, France, the United States, Germany, everybody is in the game of expanding their territory. And it's at that moment that Japan is involuntarily incorporated into the global trading system and the world interstate system by the United States, who comes in and imposes under gunpoint an unequal treaty on Japan.
15 years later, in 1868, Japan entered a transformative period, the Meiji Restoration.
So this triggers a revolution in the country, the overthrow of the old regime, and the new government that comes in immediately embarks on an aggressive and rapid program of defensive modernization.
The program's objective was to see Japan recognized as a civilized and modern state by the Western powers.
The Meiji Constitution was created because the Meiji oligarchs thought that it was necessary for a modernized, civilized nation state to have a constitution.
The constitution created a parliament known as the Diet, enshrined the supreme role of the emperor, and placed the military beyond the reach of the parliament.
Whether or not the oligarchs envisaged the rise of militarism at time of creation is debatable. It certainly made it easier for the military to intrude into politics from late 1920s onwards.
The military could act without political sanction. Their supreme head was the emperor, who, it was assumed, would never wield the extent of his power.
明治時代以来、天皇は日本の絶対的な君主として国民に国民にそういうふうに知らされてましたし、学校でもそういうふうに教えられてました。で、なかなか近づけない雲の上の存在ということになります。
The emperor was not just the head of the army, he was the father of the nation. He was owed loyalty, and he also symbolically looked after his soldiers.
The emperor was advised by his close circle of advisors, and on that advice, he would direct things like appointing the cabinet and opening the diet, taking that ceremonial role within government, but always theoretically did have the power to intervene and exercise his political voice.
After 1926, the emperor would perhaps use his position to transform Japan into a modern trading nation. But there was a problem. The country comprised a large population concentrated on a few islands. The land available for cultivation was limited, and the natural resources to fuel modern industry almost non-existent. The answer seemed to lie in imperial expansion.
She had developed an industrial base, built a modern army that needed artillery. Japan built railroads, modern warships, so she needed coal and steel to do that. And those things were not in great abundance in Japan at the level she needed, so she was going to need resources from Asia.
Within a year of Hirohito ascending the throne, a financial crisis brought down the liberal government. It was replaced by the conservative Sayukai Party, whose leader announced his intention of pursuing a stronger China policy. The rivalry between the two nations developed in 1884, when Japan supported a coup in China-dominated Korea, gaining a foothold in the region. Meanwhile, with its construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway to the port of Vladivostok, Russia hoped to expand its influence in East Asia. In a series of preemptive strikes, Japan dominated the Russian Navy.
It really cemented Japan as one of the great powers, really the first non-European nation to really sort of achieve that status. It also established the Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy as among the competitor premier military institutions in the globe.
So it was as a world power that Japan took its place in the alliance against the Central Powers in the First World War.
第一次世界大戦で日本にも総力戦という考え方が入ってきました。たくさんの近代的な兵器を作ってそれで戦争をしようという考え方です。そして、軍備の近代化が進められていきます。
In June 1919, the victorious Allies assembled at Versailles to plan the post-war world.
第一次世界大戦が終わって日本が世界の中の強国として自分の力で国際秩序を引っ張っていこう、発展させていこうというそういう考え方が生まれてきた年ですね。
Japan was to be bitterly disappointed. France, Great Britain, and the United States proved to have the loudest voices.
Japan was a British ally, was therefore on the winning side, but felt in particular the failure of the negotiators at Versailles to include any kind of racial equality clause in the final treaty was really a rebuff.
As a result, the feeling both in China and Japan that essentially the West would never treat Asian countries equally or fairly began to grow.
In 1924, the United States Congress enacted legislation excluding Japanese immigration.
One of the things that irritates the military is that Japan is not treated as equal between the great powers. You know, again, they feel insulted by this, but they also feel their own power is being undermined.
Rising nationalism, feeding on discrimination, rejected any ideas that were not authentically Japanese. The tinder was dry. Any spark would ignite nationalist sentiment.
1920年代の後半の日本の国内と国際的な大不況、これが原因だと思っています。
The British-led system of international free trade had been a major casualty in the aftermath of the First World War. In 1930, the US raised tariffs to protect American businesses and farmers, while Britain favored trade within her own empire.
陸軍は大不況を脱出するためには外国に武力で進出していろいろな資源や土地を獲得するしかないと国民に訴えました。国民もその考え方を支持していくようになります。
They feel very much threatened by those changes that are taking place in the global economy. And the onset of the Great Depression makes that much, much worse. Because Japan's major export is silk. It all goes to the United States, virtually all of it. Silk is a luxury good. After the Wall Street crash, people stop buying silk.
ですから繊維製品作ってるのは実は都市だけじゃなくて農村で絹の原料を作ってますから農村部まで大変に疲弊することになって、都市も農村もですね大変ななんて言うんでしょう経済的なひどい落ち込みようだったんです。
Resource poor Japan was ill-placed to survive a reordering of global trade. Territorial expansion offered itself as a potential solution.
恐慌で日本経済が破壊されてしまって、とにかくその海外に資源を求めたかったんですね。それから日本人が働く場所も欲しかったということで。
China was Japan's obvious target. The general election of 1928 was the first since Hirohito had been crowned emperor.
The lower house was elected. However, it was very limited because only male over 25 had the right to vote.
The turbulent economic and political climate placed a strain on the nascent democracy, and violence increasingly became a political tool. The attempted assassination of Prime Minister Hamaguchi at the hands of an ultra-nationalist ushered in what one Japanese politician called a period of brainless patriotism.
You have a series in the early 1930s of assassination attempts, which are not necessarily engineered by the military top brass, but very often involve more junior soldiers. Very often, too, with links to right-wing groups.
China was vulnerable to outside exploitation. In 1912, the Qing dynasty was overthrown and the Republic of China founded. 16 years later, Chiang Kai-shek became its leader. He had been battling the Chinese Communist Party ever since. Western governments had seized footholds for Chinese trade, and so had Japan. Amongst Japanese concessions resulting from their victory over Russia in the region were the rights to lease sections of the railways in southern Manchuria.
They rename it the South Manchurian Railway, and this becomes the beating heart of Japan's economic empire in northeast China. They also are authorized by the terms of the lease to station a militia. And so they establish what becomes the Guangdong Army. And the Guangdong Army become really important institutions in terms of independent operators.
Independence among some officers in the Guangdong Army emboldened them to make the first move. On the 18th of September 1931, Japanese troops in Manchuria, acting without authority from Tokyo, fabricated an incident to justify taking over the whole of China's northeastern region.
So the officers of the Kwantung Army decided to take matters into their own hands and staged an incident just outside Bogged.
One lieutenant wrote in his diary, "It is our duty to act decisively in the interests of our nation. It is our destiny."
Bogged is this city inside Manchuria on the railroad, and if a bomb goes off, then they can claim the Chinese set it off and initiate hostilities to conquer Manchuria.
The front page of Japan's leading daily, the Osaka Asahi, told its readers, "In an act of outrageous violence, Chinese soldiers blew up a section of track and attacked our railway guards. Our guards immediately returned fire and mobilized artillery. Half an hour after the so-called outrageous violence, a train traveled safely over the track." However, the incident was all the pretext Japan needed for a larger invasion. Within a week, the Kwantung Army had occupied an area that doubled the size of the Japanese Empire, acquiring mineral resources, space, and half the world's supply of soybeans.
The Kwantung Army is a very interesting institution. It's under the administration and the chain of command of the Imperial Japanese Army, but because it's physically separated, because it was over in Manchuria, it achieved this kind of autonomy.
But Japan's foothold in Manchuria was far from stable. The Kwantung Army continued to clash with Chinese in localized engagements.
天皇はこの関東軍のやりすぎを大変心配していました。ところが結果的にその満州を占領してしまうとそれを褒めるんですね。ですから最初のうちは心配していたけれども、欧米列強が介入してこないということが分かって、だんだんその満州を占領した既成事実を認めるようになります。
The Philadelphia Record, by no means a lone voice, said that the American people don't give a hoot in a rain barrel who controls North China. President Hoover defended America's neutrality, declaring, "These acts do not imperil the freedom of the American people." The Japanese renamed Manchuria as Manchukuo and established the last emperor of China as its nominal ruler.
They create a whole structure of an independent state that is staffed by local Chinese officials who are running everything. And this state is really just a joke. It is in some ways a colony of Japan.
In 1932, major Japanese newspapers started shuffling teams of correspondents to Manchuria. Before the Manchurian incident, recalled Toyama Shigeki, we had not taken a paper, but after articles about the local unit began to appear and articles about the war dead in our village came out, almost everybody began to take the newspaper.
There was great excitement about the war, and news stories about Manchuria and what was happening in Manchuria were continually in the news.
All the magazines were filled with articles sort of celebrating the heroic Japanese troops and how they were driving the corrupt and stupid Chinese soldiers out of Manchuria.
The Japanese Home Ministry, responsible for censorship, published a list of topics to be avoided by the press. These included reporting the army's actions on the 18th of September as a ploy to plunder natural resources or motivated by anything other than self-defense. Radio, which first broadcasted in 1925, increased regular news programming from 4 to 6 times a day.
The Manchurian incident is Japan's first radio war, really stirring up and pumping up a kind of jingoistic reaction to the Manchurian incident.
At the end of 1930, 6.1% of the population were contracted to receive radio broadcasts. By 1935, 49.8% of Tokyo households owned a radio. Newsreels that tracked the occupation of Manchuria filled public halls and packed city parks. As fast as film cans could be flown in from Manchuria, newsreels screened in department stores and elementary schools. In response to the invasion of Manchuria, anti-Japanese activity flared in the international district of Shanghai. Japan sent troops to suppress the protest, and on January 28, 1932, carrier-based Japanese aircraft bombed the Reshaped district of the city.
It's not a bloodless conquest. The Japanese bombed civilians in cities. It's one of the first cases of strategic bombing of unarmed civilians.
Osaka Minichi Film Unit explained that the purpose of its productions was to help citizens see how hard the Japanese troops in China are struggling against the marauding Chinese soldiers. In the first general election after the Manchurian incident, the Sayukai Party won a landslide victory. They were determined that Japan needed land, needed resources, needed to adopt a policy of settling 1 million families on rich Manchurian soil. On May 15th, Prime Minister Tsuyoshi Inukai, who had refused to formally recognize the puppet state of Manchukuo to appease the League of Nations, was gunned down by a group of military officers. The war minister labeled the killers irrepressible patriots.
この犬飼内閣の崩壊によって戦前における日本の政党政治というのがですね、もう途絶えてしまいました。つまり国民の怒りはですね、政党政治に向いていたんですね。その経済恐慌によるその被害というのを食い止められない政党政治に対して多くの国民が怒っていた。ですから意外にですね、その暗殺した人たちに対して国民は同情的だったんです。
After Inukai's murder, civilian politicians were confined to minor roles. An admiral, Saito Makoto, was made prime minister, and civilian politicians in the cabinet were outnumbered 2 to 1 by bureaucrats and military personnel. The military had an effective power of veto in the cabinet, which could bring down a government. The role of the elected assembly simply evaporated as military expenditure began to climb, increasing 1,200% from 1931 to 1938. Meanwhile, food shortages were widespread in northern Japan, combined with unemployment and debt. In one village, in Iwate Prefecture, the infant mortality rate in 1930 rose to 50%. A village head in Yamagata Prefecture reported in 1931 that 110 of the village's 467 girls aged between 15 and 24 had been sold as prostitutes. Japan was looking for answers. The successful invasion of Manchuria had strengthened the belief in the familiar slogan, "To the continent, because we're too crowded." The League of Nations vetoed 42 to 1 to condemn the invasion of Manchuria. Only Japan dissented. The war minister characterized the vote as the siege of Japan by the whole world. The day will come when we will make the world look up to our national virtues.
日本の民衆は最初はあまり陸軍の動きを支持していませんでしたが、国際連盟などで日本の行動が非難されると、日本の中で愛国心が高まって陸軍の行動を熱狂的に支持していくようになりました。
We shall spend a short time to carry out the investigation which has been entrusted to us by the League of Nations.
The League's inquiry into Japan's invasion of Manchuria took almost a year to table its report.
It has a lot of criticism for China, but it does not accept the Japanese case. It does not accept the case that Manchukuo was the result of an independence movement. It does not accept the case that Japan had to occupy all of Manchuria in self-defense.
Foreign Minister Uchida concluded his evidence before the commission by saying that China has been playing with Japan for too long. The endurance of the Japanese people has come to an end.
内田光斎という当時の外務大臣などは、日本の国がたとえ焦土焼け野原になったとしても満州国を支持するんだと強硬な主張をしました。それに対して積極的に反対を唱える声というのはあまりありませんでした。
Japan withdrew from the League in March 1933.
Japan finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
The American ambassador in Tokyo told his president, this step indicates complete supremacy of the military. Anticipating an all-out war, the Japanese Army and Navy launched a propaganda campaign to turn the people against the party-led government.
満州事変とそれからその結果できた満州国っていうのが当時の日本人にとっては非常にうまくいったんだと、成功したんだってこう捉えられたんですね。でそれを今度は満州じゃなくて中国の、北京周辺ですね、あそこでやろうとしたんです。ですからその満州事変のようなことをもう一回起こして第二の満州国を華北、これは北部中国ですね、ここに作ろうというんですね。
In early 1934, an army pamphlet declared, "Now Japan stands at the center of a world which has entered the Pacific Age. The Manchurian incident changed world history. The age of white race omnipotence is passing." At the end of the year, Japan gave notice of her intention to disavow her obligations under the Washington and London naval limitation treaties.
The Japanese sense of honor and of concern for national dignity and prestige would make it impossible for my country to consent to a continuation of the present ratio system. Japan is going to give notice of her intention to terminate the Washington Treaty of 1922 to have a new deal in the naval matters.
The Japanese government then officially declared the depression over, with production rising at more than 10%.
Military doesn't want its spending stopped, so there's another source of concern about the government in power wants to stop that, because they said it's going to become seriously inflationary if we carry on.
If democratic process, elections and debate did not feature in Japan from the mid-1930s, a struggle between competing factions certainly did. One faction, led by Seidao Araki, called itself Kodaha, the imperial way.
行動派というのは陸軍の中の一つのグループで反ソビエト、反共産主義で結びついていたり、
天皇中心の新しい国家を作ろう。天皇中心っていうのは、それまでですね、日本国家の中にはやはり特権階級がいっぱいいたわけですよね。財閥だとか、あるいはその地主だとか、そういう特権階級を全部なぎ倒して、天皇だけの権威によって治められる 新しい国を作ろうっていう、それが彼らの理想ではあったんですね。
They believed that morale and spirit and the Japanese superiority in spirit and fighting spirit and Bushido spirit would win. And for that kind of army, you needed a large army. But you didn't need a lot of this high technology because the Japanese soldier could defeat high technology. Blood over bullets. That was sort of their approach.
So 行動派と対立していた統制派と呼ばれる、これは東条英機たちですけれども。
They were Germanic in their approach. We need a general staff that's scientific, rational, under control of the general staff, really kind of tight control, because this is what works in warfare now, are these high-tech mass armies with tanks, artillery, airplanes, very modern small arms, repeating rifles and machine guns.
Tojo had been chief of staff of the Guangdong Army. He would later become army minister, wartime prime minister, and finally be hanged as a war criminal. The turbulent times reached a climax on February 26, 1936, when almost 1,500 officers and men associated with the Kodaha faction attempted to overthrow a government that was in favor of diplomacy and lower military spending.
陸軍の言うことを聞いて、陸軍に予算をたくさんくれる新しい政権の樹立です。
The finance minister, Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, and Inspector General of Military Education were slaughtered. The mutineers' manifesto said, "Unless we rise now, the emperor's prestige will fall to the ground." Instead of the show trials for which they hoped, 123 of the coup's leaders received secret court-martials. 19 were executed. The emperor simply issued an order for the men to return to their barracks. The mutineers supported the imperial way, but they had acted without the knowledge or permission of the emperor, and they had killed men who were close to him.
天皇が信頼していた多くの人たちを殺してしまうんですね。で、これで昭和天皇は非常に怒って、その行動派の青年将校たちを断固力でですね、その鎮圧せよっていうふうに命令します。
The coup's failure meant the suppression of the Kodaha faction, and, by default, a surge in influence for the rival Toshiha or Control faction.
They still were very, very aggressive and imperialistic in their foreign policy positions. But in order to keep these guys under control, the emperor and the political class kind of turn over foreign policy to the Japanese army. And so the army is really in the driver's seat, and the key guys on the Supreme Council for the direction of the war are the army minister, Hideki Tojo, and the chief of the Imperial Naval General Staff.
From 1931 to 1937, Japan extended its occupied territory into Jehol, Hopei, and Kaha.
In some ways, the new cities of Japanese colonial areas, particularly in Manchuria, are highlighted both in Japanese magazines, but also in international magazines. And then people can experience both the cleanliness, the speed, the sleekness, the quote, modernity that is then all associated with Japan, and that ties into this idea of Japan leading East Asia. It's the new light of East Asia.
However, Japan's presence in China was under the pretext of holding and defending Manchukuo. If the empire wanted to launch a full-scale invasion of China, Japan needed the security of international alliances. With the Soviet Union threatening the Mongolian-Manchurian border, Japan joined Germany in the 1936 Anti-Comintern Pact. But the possibility of a military alliance was demolished by the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939. On July 5, 1937, a formal agreement to cooperate against the Japanese was signed by the two parties fighting for mastery in China. The nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong.
It was less of a problem when China was very weak and divided. But what you've got by 1937 is you've got some willingness on the part of both of the Chinese communists and the Kuomintang nationalists to work together to try and help save China.
World War II broke out on the 7th of July, 1937. This is not a date that European historians generally attribute to this event, but I think there is a very strong case that actually the Second World War began in Asia, and particularly with shooting between locally garrisoned Chinese and Japanese troops at a bridge called Lugotiao, known in the West as the Marco Polo Bridge. One small, unplanned incident actually set off a powder keg that launched continental war.
From mid-July, deliberately overreacting to a minor skirmish, Japanese troops were surging into China. No longer a territorial dispute, Japan had launched a full-scale invasion, striking beyond Manchuria, expecting an easy and early victory.
So it's important to remember that at the start of this war, this was portrayed in Japan as an incident that would be over within a matter of weeks. Japanese troops would march on Nanjing, the Chinese government would surrender, and the incident would be over.
Japan had got itself into a sort of ideological trap by 1937 when full-scale war broke out between China and Japan. They had become convinced, in terms of their own domestic politics, that China was a weak opponent, almost an unworthy opponent, and that if Japan were to go to war against the Chinese, then the whole thing would be over probably in 3 or 4 months.
Obviously, a lot of young men got very excited and wanted to go off and fight. Predictably, they talk about their blood boiling and being so excited.
Now that the red slip is actually in my hands, wrote Umeda Fusao, I'm moved, excited. First I showed it to my wife, then my parents.
In the countryside, when a young man was drafted and sent off to war, the entire village would show up. And so the mayor of the town would make a speech, parties would be held, and the entire village practically would see him to the train station.
A recruit from the Kyoto prefecture was given a dagger by his mother, who said, if you're captured by the Chinese troops, use this to cut your stomach open and die. I have 3 boys already, so if I lose you, it won't bother me.
This pressure was also felt by women occasionally. One of the girls who became a Red Cross nurse said that she made her choice because there were no boys in her family, and that therefore this was one way in which her family could contribute to the war effort. And that therefore this was one way in which her family could contribute to the war effort.
By August 11th, more than 30 Japanese warships, including 5 troop transports, stood in the mouth of the Wangpu River. On August 18th, Hirohito asked his service chiefs how they intended to land a knockout blow that would quickly end the fighting. The response, delivered 2 days later, proposed a bombing campaign, a blockade, and destruction of the Central Army.
当時の天皇というのは神の子孫であるとともに軍隊の最高指揮官とされていました。ですからその天皇が軍服を着て国民の前に姿を現すことで国民に天皇の威厳を見せつけて国民を統治しようと考えました。
The first Japanese troops landed in Shanghai on August 23rd. Most would move on northern China, a vast territory in which a decisive battle did not guarantee victory.
Chiang has these very, very good divisions that were trained by the Germans. They've just come from a successful campaign against the Chinese communists in Shaanxi. And so these are really good troops, they're really good fighters. Unfortunately, they're weak in artillery compared to the Japanese. They're weak in small arms and machine guns. They're weak in aircraft, and they have absolutely no naval power. The Japanese are strong in all these areas. And of course, the Japanese have air power. Chiang Kai-shek will double down on the fighting, but it's a street-to-street, block-by-block fight between the Japanese and the best troops in the Nationalist Army.
Between August and November, the Chinese Nationalist Army lost 60% of its most effective formations and 10% of middle to lower ranked officers. But Japanese losses were also in the thousands, and hopes for a quick Chinese collapse were dashed. The Japanese strategy was Sokusen Soketsu, rapid combat, quick decision. On September 19th, Chiang Kai-shek ordered his troops to stand at Baoding. On the 20th, General Terauchi, commanding the Japanese offensive, said, "The officers and men should not return without filling their canteens from the Yellow River."
最初のうちは天皇は心配するんです。で、やはり欧米列強の介入が怖かったんですね。ところが、欧米列強が直接介入してこないと見るや、基本的には軍のやってることに賛成をして、早くその中国軍の主力を叩けということをかなり強い口調で命令します。
Combat in the vicinity of Shanghai spread west. Combat in the Tianjin-Beijing area spread west and south. By late July, major Japanese reinforcements had advanced west along the railway towards Beijing, which fell at the end of the month. Japanese troops began to push inland up the Yangtze and floated balloons over the Forbidden City in Beijing. The balloons trailed streamers that read, "The Japanese army preserves the peace of East Asia."
Shanghai is an international city, all the other powers are there, and Chiang Kai-shek decides, I am going to make my stand at Shanghai. And he throws everything at Shanghai. His best troops, all of his troops, he's going to defend it to the death. The Japanese finally prevail by sending in air power and basically pounding the Chinese soldiers from the air. And then there starts to be a retreat.
The battles of the Shanghai-Nanjing campaign lasted until the end of the year, fought in a blaze of publicity. In the late autumn, the Chinese armies fell back, and the government moved inland to Wuhan, abandoning Nanjing.
In the race from Shanghai to Nanjing, there's this deadly escalation of violence.
The fall of Nanjing united Japan's two theaters of operations, ending 1937 with an episode impossible to whitewash and difficult to understand.
By the time they get to Nanjing, everything is already broken down, complete breakdown in discipline. The high command has gotten way back behind most of these soldiers, and they start to hear reports about what's going on. There was no plans for taking prisoners of war. They couldn't feed the Japanese soldiers, much less any kind of prisoners of war. So what do? They executed them.
In the fighting until the fall of Nanjing, there had been outrages on both sides. Japanese swords had swung down on Chinese necks. Prisoners had been bayoneted, shot, and burned. But in Nanjing, it went on for weeks. soldiers and officers were guilty of murder, rape, and torture. One officer admitted to making a sea of blood in order to terrify the locals.
In the minds of the Japanese public, as long as China was in a state of civil war, it continued to pose a threat for itself and for its neighbor. In the midst of this narrative developed an image of Chinese people as disloyal, treacherous, weak, and unable to rule themselves. And these kind of racist ideologies towards the Chinese then influenced the brutality and atrocious behavior of Japanese troops in China.
The massacre in Nanjing was a big surprise and a great shock. It shocked people who expected that Japan was now a civilized, modern power.
The Japanese media was silent on events in the city. The well-documented rampage continues to be largely denied to this day. Masatake Okumiya, a Navy pilot, was a witness. He saw Chinese bound with their hands behind their backs, facing the Yangtze River. About 20 soldiers were beheading the Chinese with their swords. Nanjing was not the exception. It dominates the reported narrative of Japan's invasion, but it was emblematic, not unique. On November 15, 1937, the Nine-Power Conference, which had assembled at Brussels to debate Japan's aggression, adjourned. It rejected Japan's euphemistic characterization of the invasion and admitted to finding it difficult to understand Japan's persistent refusal to discuss a way forward. But Japan's military had a firm grip on the country. In 1931, military spending had accounted for 29% of total government expenditure. By 1938, it had risen to 75%. Japan was an industrial power whose war potential was significant, but the full-scale invasion of China had not translated into a great victory.
日本は戦争で中国を屈服させてさまざまな経済的な利権を獲得しようとしました。しかし中国はこれ以上日本に妥協することはできませんでした。そのため日中の争いは拡大していきました。
Falling back, a tactic enabled by China's size, drew Japanese forces deeper into the country, stretching supply lines. Cities and towns fell, but that had not been the objective. The aim had been to destroy China's central army and dismantle the government. The strategy failed. Instead of a short, sharp victory, Japan was bogged down in a vast and often unfriendly landscape. By 1941, Japan lost 185,000 dead and was looking for a plan B. The two factions within the military reviewed their options. One faction, driven primarily by the army, prized the economic and territorial value of northern China and Siberia. The Navy favored a strike south, into the resource-rich possessions of the Dutch, French, and British empires. Their eyes were on the tin, rubber, and oil of Southeast Asia. How would the US respond if they launched such an attack? What could Japan do to neutralize the American threat in the Pacific, clearing the way for a rapid war of conquest?